I've always been drawn to the abandoned. Maybe it's the sense of mystery and intrigue, or maybe it's the thrill of the unknown. Whatever it is, I can't resist the urge to explore deserted places, even if they're supposed to be haunted. That's how I found myself standing outside the gates of the abandoned graveyard on the outskirts of town. It was a dark and stormy night, and the wind howled through the trees like a banshee. The graveyard was overgrown with weeds and vines, and the tombstones were weathered and worn. It looked like it hadn't been visited in years. I took a deep breath and pushed open the gate. The hinges creaked ominously as I stepped inside. The graveyard was eerily silent, save for the sound of the wind and the rain. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I wandered through the graveyard, reading the tombstones as I went. Most of the people buried here had died over 100 years ago. There were a few graves from the early 19th century, but none that were recent. I came to a clearing in the center of the graveyard. In the middle of the clearing was a large mausoleum. It was made of black marble and had a heavy iron door. I approached the mausoleum and tried the doorknob. It was unlocked. I hesitated for a moment, then opened the door and stepped inside. The mausoleum was dark and damp. I could hear the sound of water dripping from somewhere. I felt my way along the wall until I found a light switch. I flicked it on, but nothing happened. I was about to turn around and leave when I saw something out of the corner of my eye. It was a sarcophagus, sitting in the center of the mausoleum. I walked over to the sarcophagus and examined it. It was made of white marble and had a carved inscription on the lid. I couldn't read the inscription in the darkness, so I took out my phone and turned on the flashlight. I shone the light on the inscription and read it aloud. Here lies the body of Abigail Stone, who died in 1850. She was a witch, and her spirit is said to still haunt this place. I shivered. I didn't believe in ghosts, but something about this place felt different. I felt like I was being watched. I decided it was time to leave. I turned and started to walk towards the door, but then I heard a noise behind me. I turned around and saw that the sarcophagus lid was starting to open. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. The sarcophagus lid opened all the way and a figure sat up. It was a woman, and she was dressed in a white gown. Her face was pale and her eyes were sunken. She looked like a corpse. The woman opened her mouth and spoke. Her voice was raspy and otherworldly. "I've been waiting for you," she said. I turned and ran towards the door, but it was closed. I pounded on the door and screamed for help, but no one came. The woman stood up and started to walk towards me. She moved slowly, but her eyes were fixed on me. I backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The woman reached out her hand and touched me. Her skin was cold and clammy. I screamed and tried to pull away, but she gripped me tightly. "You're mine now," she said. I felt a wave of coldness wash over me. My vision blurred, and I fainted. When I woke up, I was lying on the ground outside the mausoleum. The rain had stopped, and the wind had died down. I looked up at the mausoleum and saw that the door was closed. I stood up and brushed myself off. I didn't know how long I had been unconscious, but it felt like days. I started to walk back to the gate, but then I heard a voice behind me. "Not so fast," the voice said. I turned around and saw the woman standing there. She was smiling, but it was a cold, cruel smile. "You're not going anywhere," she said. I turned and ran, but she was faster. She caught me and threw me to the ground. I've always been drawn to the macabre. I'm fascinated by death and the afterlife, and I love a good ghost story. So when I heard about the haunted graveyard on the outskirts of town, I knew I had to go there. It was a dark and stormy night when I made my way to the graveyard. The wind was howling through the trees, and the rain was beating down on my face. The only light came from the moon, which was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. I wandered through the graveyard, my footsteps echoing in the silence. I passed tombstones of all shapes and sizes, some of them centuries old. I could feel the presence of the dead all around me. I came to a clearing in the graveyard, and in the center of the clearing was a large mausoleum. It was made of black marble, and it had a heavy iron door. I approached the mausoleum cautiously, and I placed my hand on the iron door. It was cold to the touch. I took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The mausoleum was dark and silent. I could see a few candles burning in the distance, but they didn't provide much light. I made my way through the mausoleum, my footsteps echoing on the stone floor. I came to a large chamber in the center of the mausoleum, and in the center of the chamber was a sarcophagus. I approached the sarcophagus slowly. It was made of white marble, and it was decorated with intricate carvings. I could see the figure of a man lying on the top of the sarcophagus. He was wearing a long white robe, and his face was covered by a hood. I reached out and placed my hand on the sarcophagus. It was cold to the touch. I took a deep breath and lifted the hood off of the man's face. The man's face was pale and gaunt. His eyes were sunken and his lips were blue. He looked like he had been dead for centuries. I gasped in horror and stepped back from the sarcophagus. I turned to run, but the door to the mausoleum slammed shut behind me. I was trapped. I tried to open the door, but it was locked. I pounded on the door and screamed for help, but no one could hear me. I was alone in the mausoleum with the dead man. I backed away from the door and looked around the chamber. I could see the candles in the distance, but they didn't provide much light. The chamber was dark and silent. I could feel the presence of the dead man all around me. I could feel his cold breath on my neck. I started to panic. I ran around the chamber looking for a way out, but there was none. I was trapped. I collapsed on the floor and started to cry. I didn't know what to do. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was coming from the sarcophagus. I slowly got to my feet and looked at the sarcophagus. The lid was starting to open. I backed away from the sarcophagus, my heart pounding. The lid of the sarcophagus opened all the way, and the dead man sat up. He looked at me with his sunken eyes. "What do you want?" he asked in a raspy voice. I couldn't speak. I was too scared. The dead man stood up and walked towards me. He placed his cold hand on my shoulder. "I'm going to take you with me," he said. I screamed and tried to run, but the dead man held me in place. He dragged me to the sarcophagus and pushed me inside. I closed my eyes and screamed. I could feel the cold marble of the sarcophagus against my skin. I could feel the dead man's hand on my shoulder. "Goodbye," he said. I felt the lid of the sarcophagus close over my head. I was plunged into darkness. I screamed and pounded on the lid of the sarcophagus, but it was no use. I was trapped. I lay in the darkness for hours, listening to the sound of my own heartbeat. I was terrified. I knew that I was going to die. Suddenly, I heard a noise. It was the sound of someone digging. I waited with bated breath. The sound of digging got closer and closer. Finally, the lid of the sarcophagus opened. I looked up and saw a man standing over me. He was holding a shovel. "Are you okay?"